thundering past at incredible speed. The sound of the diesel rumbling the ground as it takes the passengers from all the way in Washington, D.C., through scenic views such as the Blue Ridge Mountains and Shenandoah Valley, and on the way to Cincinnati, Ohio. The silver of the carriages reflecting in the sun with highlights of the yellow and blue. This is the C&O's George Washington, the flagship of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. Next week's video will be about the Milwaukee Road's famous electric locomotives like the bipolar and the iconic Little Joe that was originally destined for the Soviet Union, but fate changed its mind and it ended up in the Milwaukee Road's hands. Also, a new type of video will be dropping soon about modeling the Norfolk and Western Powhatan arrow. This will be a great way to figure out exactly what you need and the options you have and how to model the train accurately, so be very excited for that. So if you're interested, don't forget to like and subscribe if you like these types of videos. The George Washington would be named after the founding father of the United States by the Chesapeake and Ohio to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the birth of George Washington in 1932. This train would travel from Washington, D.C., passing through the Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah Valley, before arriving at the Greenbrier Resort located in the White Sulphur Springs of West Virginia. It would then travel through the New River Gorge and finally arrive in Cincinnati, Ohio. This train would be one of the nicest trains when it began in 1932. There was only 2 trains at this time that featured air conditioning throughout the entire train. The other was Baltimore and Ohio's Capital Limited. Initially, the carriages used would be a refurbished heavyweight Pullman set. Unlike on the other railroads, Pullman Company's passenger cars would be marked with a Chesapeake and Ohio on the center instead of Pullman. Pullman instead would be lettered in smaller letters on the ends of the cars. To match this greater sense of luxury, china created by the Buffalo Pottery of New York would be used in the dining car. To pull this magnificent train, like on other railroads, a 484 locomotive would be used to pull the heavy George Washington across the mountains. This locomotive would be the Chesapeake and Ohio Greenbrier J3 class. The C&O would choose to name their 484 classes after the Greenbrier Resort at the White Sulphur Springs. 5 of these J3 classes would be produced by Lima Locomotive Works for the heavy passenger service, such as the George and the Sportsman. In 1942, a second batch of the J3 class would be made. Like the original 5, they would also be given names after Virginian statesmen. In 1948, 5 more of these locomotives would be built under the J3A designation. These were unnamed and featured many improvements over the original J3s built in 1935. Things such as a box-top driving wheels instead of the original spokes, and cast steel frames instead of the bar frames. Now, these would be the last commercially built 484s, as the locomotives such as the Norfolk and Western J-class that was built later would be built by the railroad's own workshop at Roanoke. To promote the George Washington and other Chesapeake and Ohio passenger trains, a new mascot would first appear in 1933 in the Fortune magazine as part of an ad. A sleeping kitten, illustrated by Viennese Guido Grunwald, would be matched with the new C&O slogan of "Sleep like a kitten." On Chessie's first appearance, it was simply a winner for the C&O. Within 2 days of it being circulated, offices would be full of requests to reprint the ad. Instead of reprinting the ad, the C&O would print 40,000 calendars for the year of 1934, with Chessie the cat in it. These calendars would sell out incredibly quick. And in the next year, they would print out 100,000 and would still sell out extremely quickly. 1935 would also mark the appearance of Chessie the Cat's children, Nip and Tuck. Later in 1937, Chessie's mate would be introduced as a tomcat who was a soldier away at war. Chessie the Cat would become even more renowned through the war, becoming America's sleep warden after a story of Chessie the Cat giving up her Pullman berth for traveling soldiers. Chessie the Cat would later become the mascot of the future holding company that would own the Western Maryland, Baltimore and Ohio, and the Chesapeake and Ohio. This company would be known as Chessie Systems, and Chessie the Cat would appear on all Chessie locomotives. In 1942, the new president of the C&O, Robert Young, pushed innovation at the forefront of the Chesapeake and Ohio. One aspect that he chose to push was the improvement of passenger services as a whole. Part of this was a new ultra-luxury train that would be able to compete with the very best, such as the iconic Broadway Limited of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the 20th Century Limited owned by the New York Central. This new train would be named after the famous mascot of the C&O, Chessie the Cat. The Chessie was a state-of-the-art train equipped with the new Pullman lightweight carriages and a new steam turbine named the M1. This Chessie train was seen as a potential new flagship for the C&O, replacing the George Washington. The M1 was part of a new plan to replace the old with the new, increasing luxury, speed, over the conventional steam that hauled the George Washington. The reason for a steam turbine instead of diesels like other railroads had been exploring at the time, like the Santa Fe, was due to the C&O being massive coal haulers, and fears of oil reserves being drained within 30 years at this time. 3 M1 class steam turbine locomotives would be built between 1947 and 1948 for the new Chessie service. The M1 steam turbine would use a steam turbine that drove 4 generators, and those generators would power 8 traction motors as a whole. It's not very clear how powerful this locomotive would be, but it would be very certain that it would be up with the top locomotives in sheer power. The reason for a steam turbine was a belief that it would be cheaper to run and be more reliable because it had fewer moving parts compared to a regular steam engine, just like the Alco 484s being built at the time. It is also noticed that because it used coal, the C&O was a major coal hauler and it wanted something that would be able to use coal. Despite the plans that would be cheaper to run overall, they were unreliable and incredibly expensive to run. Eventually, the train would be cancelled, and it was simply due to increased competition from road and air travel. Combined with the cancellation of the Chessie service, the M1 locomotives and Pullman cars would now have to see a new purpose. Unfortunately, the M1s were too problematic to find a place in the Chesapeake and Ohio, and they would be scrapped in 1950. Some of these Pullman lightweights would actually enter service on the George Washington and other C&O trains. The George would remain the flagship of the C&O. Robert Young was incredibly innovative when it came to passenger services. It was a railroad that trialed not tipping on dining car services, pay on train ticketing services, meaning that a passenger could turn up, join the train, and pay for a ticket on the train itself, rather than having to go to a booking office. It also featured the Chesapeake and Ohio Central Reservation Bureau that allowed passengers to simply call up and book a ticket over the phone without being charged for the phone call. These made the C&O trains incredibly competitive. However, the no tipping policy would be changed due to an awkwardness from passengers over the tipping policy on board. As part of the re-equipping of the George Washington was new locomotives and new coaches in the 1950. The new 1950 coaches would have featured new reclining seats and be portioned in the middle to have a more luxurious feel. However, this allowed the cars to be easily segregated into separate black and white sections when entering states with Jim Crow laws. For the George Washington, this would be the states of Washington, D.C., Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Not wanting to be the last one to see the advantages of diesel, the Chesapeake and Ohio started to recognize the advantages of diesel over regular steam locomotives. As part of further dieselization efforts, the C&O would purchase E8As. No purchase of booster units would be made. The C&O would have 10 E7As from the purchase of the Pierre Marquette Railroad, 6 E7As purchased between 1946 and 1948, and 31 8E8As would be purchased. In general, the E units would be triple-headed when working the heavy mountain passenger trains such as the George. Due to the purchase of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in 1960, B&O coaches would start to show up in the consists more commonly. To also show increasing ownership of the Baltimore and Ohio, coaches started to appear in a similar livery to the C&O, marked with the yellow and black stripes. The B&O icons would also feature on the both ends of the car. Unlike other big passenger trains at the time, the Washington would not use a special end observation type car. It would be ended with a simple 72-foot mail storage car. The end of passenger services on the C&O would end on May 1st, 1971, when Amtrak took over inner-city passenger rail services. Amtrak would still run the George. However, 2 months later in July, Amtrak would integrate the ex-New York Central James Whitcomb Riley into the George. It would exchange cars at Cincinnati to allow cars to travel from Chicago and from Washington to Chicago. On November 14, 1971, the trains would properly merge. The George Washington would now become the eastbound service and the Riley for the westbound service. This train would later be fully named to the Riley, starting on May 19, 1974, and the Riley would be named the Cardinal in 1977, signaling the end of the George Washington train. Part of this route is still used by the Amtrak's Cardinal when it travels between Washington and Chicago. Thank you for your continued support, and it's seriously appreciated. I hope I can always make content that you guys watch and enjoy. Next week's video will be about the Milwaukee Road's electric locomotive, like the Little Joe or the Bipolar. So if you're interested, we also now have a group chat on Discord, so come on down if you want to talk all about trains or modeling in general. The link will be in the description. Also, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you're interested. I just want to say thank you from me, my partner, and Mr. Morris.